Whispers of the White Divide, Chapter 1, The Ascent. The tires of the rented Ford Explorer spun for a precarious second before catching the icy grit of the mountain road. Arthur, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles stark white against the dark leather. He was a long way from the ceaseless hum of Chicago. Here, in the jagged teeth of the Colorado Rockies, the silence was heavy enough to crush a man. The cabin, a sprawling A-frame structure of dark timber and riverstone, sat at the end of a winding driveway that hadn't seen a snowplow in days. Arthur had rented it for 2 months. 2 months to finish his manuscript. 2 months away from the ringing phones, the demanding editors, and the empty apartment that felt too large since Sarah left. As he finally parked the SUV, the engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound competing with the howling wind. The snow was falling horizontally now, a blinding white static that erased the tree line. He pulled his heavy wool coat tighter around his collar, grabbed his duffel bag and his battered leather briefcase, and pushed the car door open. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. "All right, Arthur," he muttered to himself, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Just like you wanted. Total isolation." The cabin was imposing. Its steep roof was burdened with several feet of pristine snow, and the dark windows reflected the swirling storm, looking like hollow eyes staring back at him. He fumbled with the rusted lockbox on the porch, his fingers numb despite his thick gloves, until the satisfying click of the heavy brass key finally surrendered to his grip. Stepping inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of old pine dust and cold ash. It was freezing, perhaps colder inside than out. Arthur dropped his bags on the woven rug in the entryway and immediately went to work on a massive stone fireplace dominating the living room. The owners had promised a cord of dry wood out back, but thankfully, a small pile of kindling and split logs rested on the hearth. It took 3 matches and a lot of gentle blowing to coax the flames to life. As the fire caught, casting long dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling, Arthur took his first real look around. It was beautifully rustic. Plaid wool blankets draped over oversized leather armchairs, a large oak dining table, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining the far wall. It was the quintessential American mountain retreat, a place where time was supposed to slow down. He walked over to the large bay window. The storm outside had escalated into a full-blown blizzard. The weather report on the radio during his drive up had warned of a once-in-a-decade front moving in from Canada. By tomorrow morning, he'd be completely snowed in. The nearest town, Silver Creek, was 20 miles down the mountain, and the winding road he'd just navigated would be impassable. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the woods outside, loud enough to penetrate the thick glass. Arthur flinched. Just a frozen branch snapping under the weight of the snow, he reasoned, though a cold prickle of unease washed over the back of his neck. He moved to the kitchen, a cozy space with updated appliances that clashed slightly with the rustic aesthetic, and turned the faucet. Nothing. He tried the hot water handle. Still nothing. Perfect, he sighed. The pipes had frozen. He remembered the property manager mentioning a backup generator and a water pump switch in the basement. Arthur grabbed a heavy iron flashlight from the kitchen counter and found the narrow door tucked beneath the main staircase. The wooden stairs groaned in protest under his weight. The air down here was different, damp, earthy, and metallic. He swept the beam of the flashlight across the concrete walls. Cardboard boxes, old ski equipment, and a tarp-covered shape that looked like an old snowmobile occupied the corners. He found the utility panel and flipped the heavy breaker for the pump. A deep, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. Water problem solved. But as he turned to head back upstairs, the beam of his flashlight caught something scrawled on the concrete wall behind the boiler. It wasn't painted. It looked as if it had been scratched into the surface with something sharp. Arthur stepped closer, wiping away a layer of grime with his gloved thumb. The scratches formed letters, jagged and frantic. D-O not let it hear you. Arthur stared at the words, the low hum of the water pump suddenly sounding like a low growl. He let out a nervous chuckle, the sound flat and hollow in the basement. Kids, previous renters, playing a prank. It had to be. He turned his back on the wall and hurried up the stairs, locking the basement door behind him with a little more force than necessary. The fire in the living room was roaring now, pushing back the chill, but the warmth couldn't quite reach the sudden icy knot in Arthur's stomach. Outside, the wind shrieked against the eaves, sounding terribly, unmistakably, like a voice. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 2. The first night. Arthur spent the next hour trying to convince himself he was a rational adult. He unpacked his groceries in the kitchen, meticulously arranging cans of soup, boxes of pasta, and a small arsenal of coffee on the wooden shelves. He forced the scratching in the basement out of his mind. Do not let it hear you. It was a joke. A stupid, cliché cabin-in-the-woods prank left by some bored college kids the previous winter. Still, he found himself walking softer than usual, his wool socks padding silently against the pine floorboards. Dinner was a simple affair, a bowl of canned chili eaten standing over the kitchen sink. Outside, the blizzard had erased the world. There was no sky, no trees, no driveway, just an impenetrable wall of swirling white. The thermometer mounted outside the kitchen window read 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still dropping. He moved to the living room and set up his workspace on the large oak dining table. He plugged in his laptop, organized his notes, and placed a steaming mug of black coffee beside it. The blinking cursor on the blank screen seemed to mock him. This was the routine. Sit down, bleed onto the page, repeat. But tonight, the words wouldn't come. His mind kept wandering to the sheer scale of his isolation. If he had a heart attack right now, or if he fell and broke his leg, no one would know. The landline telephone in the kitchen was dead. He checked it twice. The property manager had warned him that the lines often went down during heavy snows. His cell phone displayed a bleak "no service" in the top corner. He was cut off, tethered to humanity only by the thin thread of the power lines that miraculously were still holding up against the storm. Around 10 p.m., the wind shifted. It no longer threw itself against the front of the cabin. Instead, it seemed to circle the structure, whistling down the stone chimney and making the flames dance frantically. Arthur closed his laptop with a sigh. He hadn't written a single usable sentence. He picked up a half-empty bottle of bourbon he bought in Denver and poured 2 fingers into a glass. He settled into one of the leather armchairs facing the fire, the heat radiating against his shins. The exhaustion of the drive was finally catching up to him. His eyelids grew heavy. The hypnotic crackle of the dry logs was a soothing lullaby. Thump. Arthur's eyes snapped open. He sat perfectly still, his breath hitched in his chest. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. Just the roaring wind. Just the house settling, he whispered. Taking a slow sip of the bourbon, log cabins expanded and contracted in the extreme cold. It was perfectly normal. Thump. Scrape. It didn't come from the roof. It came from the front porch. Arthur slowly placed his glass on the side table. The sound was distinct. It was the heavy, muffled impact of something solid hitting the wooden deck, followed by a wet, dragging noise, like a heavy sack of wet sand being pulled across the planks. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He crept toward the entryway, keeping his back to the wall, out of the direct line of sight from the windows. The front door was solid oak, thick and heavy, but the small, frosted glass pane at eye level offered a distorted view of the porch. Arthur held his breath and pressed the side of his face against the cold wood, trying to peer through the frosted glass. Nothing. Just the frantic swirling of snow illuminated by the amber glow of the porch light. Then the porch light flickered. Once, twice, and died, plunged into the sudden gloom. The only light in the entryway came from the dying fire in the living room behind him. Arthur's grip tightened on the doorknob, checking the deadbolt for the 3rd time. It was locked. Scrape. It was right outside the door, less than 2 feet away from him. Whatever it was large enough to block the faint, ambient light of the moon reflecting off the snow. A massive, dark shape obscured the frosted glass pane. Arthur's mouth went dry. He remembered the shotgun he'd seen in the master bedroom closet. A rusted over-under 12 gauge the owner said was just for show. Suddenly, he really hoped he could find some shells. He took a slow step backward. The floorboard beneath his heel let out a loud, sharp creak. The dragging sound on the porch stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. The thing outside was listening. Do not let it hear you. Arthur froze, a cold bead of sweat tracing a line down his spine. For a long, agonizing minute, neither he nor the shape on the other side of the door moved. Then, very slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 3. The Cold Iron. The heavy brass doorknob turned a quarter inch, stopped, and then wrenched hard to the right with a violent metallic clatter. The deadbolt held, but the solid oak door shuddered in its frame. Arthur scrambled backward, abandoning any attempt at stealth. He sprinted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. The wood groaned beneath his boots, but he no longer cared about making noise. The thing outside already knew he was there. He burst into the master bedroom, the air inside noticeably colder than the ground floor. The moonlight, filtering through the frost-caked windows, provided just enough illumination to cast long, skeletal shadows across the room. He threw open the doors to the walk-in closet, frantically tearing through heavy winter coats and dusty garment bags until his hands met the cold, hard steel of the shotgun barrel leaning in the back corner. It was an old Remington over-under, heavy and smelling faintly of gun oil and dust. Arthur cracked the breech. Empty. Come on, he muttered, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the weapon. He dropped to his knees, ripping open the drawers of a small cedar dresser inside the closet. Thermal underwear, thick wool socks, an old map of the Arapaho National Forest, and finally, at the very back of the bottom drawer, a heavy, square cardboard box. He pulled it out. Winchester .12 gauge buckshot. It looked like it had been sitting there since the late 90s. He fumbled with the cardboard flap, spilling half the heavy red shells onto the wooden floor. They clattered loudly, rolling into the dark corners. He grabbed two, his frozen, clumsy fingers struggling to align them with the open chambers. With a sharp, metallic clack, he snapped the barrel shut. He fumbled with the cardboard flap, spilling half the heavy red shells onto the wooden floor. They clattered loudly, rolling into the dark corners. He grabbed two, his frozen, clumsy fingers struggling to align them with the open chambers. With a sharp, metallic clack, he snapped the barrel shut. Armed, he felt a microscopic sliver of courage return. He wasn't a hunter, but he had grown up around guns in rural Pennsylvania. He knew enough to point and pull. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Leveling the barrel toward the bedroom door, he listened. The wind was a constant shrieking roar against the roof, but beneath it, he strained to hear the scraping on the porch. Nothing. Had it given up? Was it just a starving grizzly bear looking for an easy meal in the trash cans? Bears shouldn't even be awake. They were supposed to be hibernating deep in the snowpack by now. But the brutal winter front could make animals do desperate things. Arthur slowly lowered the shotgun. He needed to know if the front of the cabin was clear. He crept out of the bedroom and moved down the hallway, stopping at the top of the stairs. From here, he had a vantage point overlooking the living room and the entryway. The fire had burned down to glowing orange embers, casting a dim, flickering light across the furniture. The front door remained closed, intact. Then he heard it again, but it wasn't on the front porch anymore. Crunch, crunch. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps compressing the deep snow outside. And it was moving. It was walking along the side of the cabin, heading toward the back, toward the massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows in the living room. Arthur's stomach plummeted. The front door was solid oak, but the back of the house was mostly glass. If a hungry grizzly decided to come through those windows, it wouldn't take much effort. He descended the stairs, leveling the shotgun ahead of him. His eyes remained locked on the dark panes of glass at the far end of the living room. The storm outside was a swirling vortex of white and gray, making it impossible to see more than a few feet past the deck. He reached the bottom step and pressed his back against the stone masonry of the fireplace. Crunch, crunch. The footsteps stopped right outside the middle pane of the bay window. Arthur raised the heavy 12-gauge, tucking the stock firmly into his shoulder. He aimed squarely at the center of the glass, his finger resting lightly against the cold metal trigger. For a terrifying moment, the wind seemed to die down, creating a vacuum of silence in the cabin. Then, something pressed against the outside of the glass. It wasn't a bear's snout. It was a hand, or at least something resembling one. It was impossibly long, pale, and covered in a thin layer of frost. It left a wet, melting handprint against the window pane. 5 elongated, jointed fingers tapped a rhythmic, hollow beat against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Before Arthur could even process the impossible sight, the overhead lights in the kitchen hummed loudly, flickered, and died. The hum of the refrigerator ground to a halt. The power grid had finally failed. The cabin was plunged into total, suffocating darkness. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 4. The Descent. The sudden absence of the refrigerator's hum left a ringing silence in Arthur's ears, instantly filled by the relentless, shrieking assault of the blizzard against the cabin walls. The pitch black was absolute, save for the faint, ghostly luminescence of the snow reflecting through the windows. He didn't move. He kept the bead of the shotgun leveled at the center pane of the bay window, his breathing shallow and rapid. Tap, tap, tap. It happened again, but the rhythm was slower this time, almost mocking. Then the elongated shadow blocking the ambient light shifted and slid away into the swirling white void. It didn't crunch through the snow. It simply vanished, swallowed by the storm. Arthur's arms ached from the tension, but he refused to lower the 12 gauge. Just a bear, he whispered through chattering teeth, though his logical mind screamed that no bear possessed long, jointed fingers. The ambient temperature in the cabin was already dropping. Without the electric blowers for the central heating, the weak embers in the fireplace wouldn't be enough to keep the pipes, or him, from freezing solid by morning. He needed the backup generator. The heavy iron flashlight. He had left it on the kitchen counter next to the sink. Arthur began to inch backward, sliding his boots carefully across the pine floorboards to avoid the creaks. He kept the gun raised, sweeping the muzzle back and forth across the dark expanse of the living room. When his back finally hit the edge of the kitchen counter, he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He reached out with his left hand, patting the cold laminate surface blindly. A coffee mug, a stray spoon. Finally, his cold, stiff fingers brushed against the knurled metal grip of the flashlight. He picked it up, rested the barrel of the shotgun heavily on his forearm, and clicked the heavy rubber button. A stark white beam of LED light pierced the gloom. Arthur immediately swung it toward the bay window. Nothing was there. The deck was empty, buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. But right in the center of the middle pane, perfectly illuminated by the beam, was the handprint. The frost had melted away where the flesh had pressed against the glass. It was terrifyingly large, the fingers extending several inches longer than a human's, ending in sharp, tapered points. Arthur felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He tore his gaze away from the glass and swung the beam toward the hallway. The door to the basement, tucked under the stairs, loomed in the shadows. He had to go down there. The generator was his only lifeline, but the memory of the scratched warning on the concrete wall flashed vividly in his mind. Do not let it hear you. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight, gripping the shotgun tightly in his right hand and the flashlight in his left. He closed the distance to the basement door. He reached out and turned the deadbolt he had locked just hours ago. It clicked loudly in the quiet hallway. Arthur turned the knob and pulled the door open. A draft of freezing, stagnant air rushed up from the dark stairwell, carrying with it a scent that hadn't been there before. It smelled like wet earth, copper, and something sickeningly sweet, like rotting meat left in a freezer. He shined the flashlight down the wooden steps. The beam cut through the dust, motes dancing in the air, illuminating the concrete floor at the bottom. Everything looked exactly as he had left it. The cardboard boxes, the tarp-covered snowmobile, the boiler. But as he took his first heavy step down, the floorboards groaning under his weight, a sound echoed from the far, dark corner of the basement. It was a wet, ragged breath, and it wasn't his. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 5. The Generator. Arthur stood paralyzed at the top of the basement stairs, that wet, ragged breath echoing from the dark corner below was louder in his mind than the howling blizzard outside. Every rational instinct he possessed screamed at him to slam the door shut, drag the heavy oak dining table over it, and keep a vigil by the fading fire until dawn. But without the generator, the cabin's internal temperature would drop below freezing in hours. The cold was a guaranteed death sentence. Whatever was down there was only a potential one. He shined the harsh white beam of the heavy flashlight down the stairwell. The light cut through a thick haze of dust motes, splashing against the bare concrete floor. It looked entirely unremarkable. The cardboard boxes, the leaning skis, the tarp-covered snowmobile in the far corner, leveling the barrel of the 12-gauge alongside the flashlight, he took his first step down. The wooden tread shrieked in protest under his weight. Instantly, the ragged breathing below stopped. Arthur held his breath. The thing in the basement was listening. "Do not let it hear you." The warnings scratched into the concrete, flashed in his mind like a neon sign. Second step, third step. The deeper he descended, the stronger the smell became. It wasn't just damp earth anymore. It was the sharp, metallic tang of copper mixed with the sickly sweet stench of rotting meat. His stomach heaved, but he forced his legs to keep moving. When his boots finally met the concrete floor, he pressed his back against the wall, sweeping the flashlight in jerky, frantic arcs. Boiler, water pump, the tarp. Everything was still. The generator's control panel was mounted on the wall in the exact opposite corner of the room, cloaked in the heaviest shadows. To reach it, he had to cross the open floor. Arthur began to inch sideways, keeping his eyes glued to the tarp covering the snowmobile. The sound had come from there. When he finally reached the panel, he had to tear his gaze away for a split second to locate the main breaker switch. With the flashlight, in that fraction of a second, he heard a wet, leathery slap behind him. The tarp had slid off the snowmobile onto the floor. Arthur didn't look. His numb fingers scrambled over the metal panel, grabbing the heavy main breaker and shoving it upward with all his strength. In the same motion, he slammed his fist into the generator's red ignition button. The large diesel motor coughed, sputtered, and roared to life with a deafening, mechanical bellow. At the exact same moment, The flickering fluorescent tubes bolted to the basement ceiling violently popped on, flooding the room with harsh, sterile light. Arthur spun around, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. What he saw behind the snowmobile was not a bear. It wasn't a starving drifter either. Crouching on the concrete was a figure that defied the natural order. Its skin was a sickly, translucent gray, stretched so tight over its bones that it looked wet. It possessed long, spindly limbs that bent at grotesque, impossible angles, folded up like a massive, starving spider trying to make itself small. As the fluorescent light hit it, the creature threw an elongated, multi-jointed arm over its face to shield its eyes. They were the same hands that had left the melting print on the window upstairs. The creature let out an ear-piercing, vibrating shriek that somehow cut right through the roaring of the generator. Arthur didn't think. He pulled the trigger. The blast of the 12 gauge in the confined space was like a bomb going off. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, and a cloud of red-hot buckshot shredded the air, but in the fraction of a second it took for the hammer to fall, the creature moved. It didn't run. It scrambled backward with horrifying, insect-like speed. The buckshot hammered into the concrete wall where the thing's head had been a millisecond before, sending up a thick cloud of pulverized stone and dust. Before Arthur could rack the action, or even process that he had missed, the creature scrambled up the sheer concrete wall, its long fingers finding purchase in microscopic cracks. It slithered upward like liquid nightmare and vanished into the wide, rusted grate of the central air return duct near the ceiling. Arthur stumbled backward, coughing on the acrid smoke of burnt gunpowder and concrete dust. His ears were ringing violently. The generator chugged steadily behind him. Upstairs, he could hear the faint, comforting hum of the refrigerator kicking back on, and the electric blowers of the furnace forcing warm air through the vents. The power was back. But as Arthur stared at the dark, empty grate of the air duct, his blood ran colder than the ice outside. He only had one shell left in the chamber, and the thing wasn't locked outside in the storm anymore. It was in the walls. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 6. The Breath of the House. Arthur didn't wait to see if the creature would poke its elongated, pale head back out of the rusted grate. He broke his paralysis, turning his back on the basement and sprinting up the wooden stairs faster than his freezing muscles should have allowed. He burst through the door into the main hallway, slamming it shut behind him with a deafening crack. He twisted the deadbolt so hard his fingers ached, but the flimsy lock suddenly felt like a joke. A piece of brass and pine wasn't going to stop something that could scale a sheer concrete wall like a centipede. Looking around wildly, his eyes landed on a heavy, antique oak console table in the entryway. Dropping the flashlight, he grabbed the table by its edges and hauled it across the floorboards, ignoring the painful screech of wood on wood. He shoved it flush against the basement door, wedging it tightly beneath the doorknob. He leaned against the table, chest heaving, gasping for air that tasted of dust and adrenaline. His shoulder throbbed violently from the recoil of the 12 gauge. One shell left. He cracked the breech of the shotgun just to check, his trembling thumb tracing the brass rim of the single remaining Winchester shell. He snapped it shut. It wasn't enough. Not against that thing. Then the furnace kicked in. With a deep, rhythmic hum, the cabin's central heating system roared to life, pushing warm air up from the basement boiler and out into the rooms. A vent on the floorboards, just a few feet from where Arthur stood, fluttered open. A rush of hot air hit his ankles. For a fraction of a second, the warmth was a profound relief. But then, the smell hit him. It wasn't the dry, dusty scent of a furnace turning on for the first time in weeks. It was the same sickening odor from the basement. Wet earth, old copper, and rotting meat carried upward on the artificial breeze. Arthur's blood ran cold. The vents. The creature had vanished into the air. Return duct in the basement. The ductwork connected every single room in the cabin. The walls were no longer a barrier against the storm. They were a highway for the monster. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. He looked at the floor register. The metal slats were wide enough for a man's fingers to slip through. Were they wide enough for those pale, multi-jointed claws? Arthur ran to the kitchen. He yanked open the heavy, lower cabinets, the pots and pans clattering loudly. He grabbed the two heaviest items he could find, a massive cast-iron Dutch oven and a thick granite mortar and pestle. He hurried back to the hallway and slammed the Dutch oven upside down over the floor vent. Clang! He needed to block them all. He ran back to the living room, grabbing the heavy, unburnt oak logs from the pile next to the fireplace. He dropped them violently over the vent near the bay window. He dragged a heavy leather armchair over another one near the bookshelves. As he moved frantically through the ground floor, weighing down every piece of grated metal he could find, with encyclopedias, heavy winter boots, and canned goods from the pantry, the cabin began to speak. It started as a faint, metallic ping. Arthur froze in the center of the kitchen, a cast-iron skillet in his hand. He tilted his head, listening. Ping, skirk. It was coming from above him, the sound of something heavy shifting its weight on thin sheet metal. Skirk, skirch. The long, razor-sharp nails. He could hear them dragging against the inside of the aluminum ductwork running between the first floor and the master bedroom upstairs. The creature was crawling through the ceiling. Arthur slowly backed out of the kitchen, keeping his eyes glued to the plaster above him. He tracked the sound. The scratching moved methodically, heavily, dragging itself over the dining room table, then pausing directly above the vaulted ceiling of the living room. It knew exactly where he was. It was tracking his movements from inside the floorboards. Arthur gripped the shotgun, pointing the barrel toward the high wooden beams of the ceiling. The lights flickered slightly, a temporary surge from the generator, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. Thump! Something heavy struck the ductwork from the inside, right above the center of the living room. Dust sprinkled down from the wooden planks, catching in the warm, artificial light. Arthur swallowed hard, his finger resting on the trigger. He backed up until he hit the cold stone masonry of the fireplace. He was completely boxed in. The storm raged outside the frosted windows, a blinding wall of ice and snow, and inside, the walls were literally crawling. He needed a plan. He needed more ammunition, or a way to trap it, or a way to call for help. He remembered the property manager's offhand comment when handing over the keys. If things get really bad and the lines go down, there's an old CB radio in the attic. My grandfather used it back in the day. The attic, which meant going upstairs, right where the creature was currently hunting him from. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 7. The Ascent into the Dark. The ceiling groaned again, a long, agonizing scrape of claws against aluminum that sent a fresh wave of ice water through Arthur's veins. He stood backed against the stone fireplace, his knuckles white around the grip of the shotgun. He had to move. Staying on the ground floor, waiting for that pale, multi-jointed nightmare to find a vent it could rip open, was suicide. The CB radio in the attic was his only shot. If he could reach it, if he could broadcast an SOS to the highway patrol or the ranger station in Silver Creek, maybe they could send a snowcat. Maybe he wouldn't die in this frozen tomb. But the attic was on the 3rd level. He had to go upstairs. Right into the belly of the beast, Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting the metallic tang of fear and the lingering scent of copper in the air. He slipped the heavy iron flashlight into the deep pocket of his wool coat. He needed both hands on the 12 gauge. He had one shell left, one chance to make it count. He pushed off the masonry, stepping lightly on the balls of his feet. The generator hummed steadily from the basement, a low vibration that masked some of the cabin's natural creaks, but not all of them. He approached the staircase, staring up into the gloom. The weak glow from the living room lamps didn't quite reach the top landing. He took the first step. Above him, the scratching in the ceiling abruptly stopped. Arthur froze, his boot hovering over the second step. The sudden absence of noise was infinitely worse than the scratching. It meant the creature was listening. It meant it was waiting. Do not let it hear you. He swallowed the dry lump in his throat and brought his foot down. Creak. It was deafening in the silence. He grimaced, tightening his grip on the shotgun, and kept moving. Halfway up the stairs, the temperature noticeably dropped. The furnace was blasting hot air downstairs, but up here, it felt like the heat was being swallowed by a vacuum. He could see his own breath pluming in the dim light. He reached the top landing and pressed his back tightly against the wall. The second-floor hallway stretched out before him, a narrow corridor with 3 doors. To his left, the guest bathroom. Straight ahead, the spare bedroom he was using as a storage space. And to his right, at the very end of the hall, the master bedroom where he had found the ammunition. Directly above the master bedroom door was the square outline of the attic access panel, complete with a dangling nylon cord. Arthur pulled the flashlight from his pocket with his left hand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty hardwood floor. He took a step toward the master bedroom. Then he saw it. The door to the master bedroom was wide open. But that wasn't what made Arthur's stomach drop. Lying in the center of the hallway, illuminated by his trembling flashlight beam, was a heavy cast-iron floor register. It was twisted and mangled, the thick metal slats bent outward as if they were made of cheap tin. The wood around the vent hole in the master bedroom had been violently splintered, jagged shards jutting up into the air. The creature wasn't in the ductwork anymore. It was out. It was on this floor. A fresh wave of the rotting meat odor washed over him, so strong this time it made his eyes water. It was coming from inside the master bedroom. Arthur's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The attic pull cord was dangling just 3 feet away from the open doorway of the master bedroom. To reach it, he would have to expose his back to whatever was lurking in the dark corners of that room. And once he pulled the cord, the folding wooden stairs would drop down with a loud, unavoidable clatter. He inched closer, the barrel of the shotgun leading the way. He swept the beam of the flashlight into the master bedroom. The beam washed over the unmade bed, the cedar dresser, the open closet door. The room appeared empty. The frost-caked window rattled violently against the wind, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Just pull the cord and climb, Arthur told himself, his internal voice practically screaming. Pull it, climb, and pull the stairs up behind you. He took one more step, positioning himself directly beneath the attic panel. He reached his left hand up, his gloved fingers grazing the fraying nylon cord. As he gripped it, a sound emerged from the darkness of the master bedroom. It wasn't a scratch. It wasn't a thump. It was a voice. Ah. The pronunciation was wet, guttural, and horribly distorted, like vocal cords that had forgotten how to form human words. It mimicked the cadence of his own voice, completely devoid of emotion. Arthur's blood turned to ice. He jerked the nylon cord downward. The wooden panel swung open, and the heavy folding stairs crashed down onto the hallway floor with a thunderous bang. From the shadows of the master bedroom ceiling, directly above the closet door, a pale, elongated figure dropped to the floor with a sickening, meaty thud. It uncoiled its impossible limbs, its hollow black eyes locking onto Arthur. Arthur's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The attic pull cord was dangling just 3 feet away from the open doorway of the master bedroom. To reach it, he would have to expose his back to whatever was lurking in the dark corners of that room. And once he pulled the cord, the folding wooden stairs would drop down with a loud, unavoidable clatter. He inched closer, the barrel of the shotgun leading the way. He swept the beam of the flashlight into the master bedroom. The beam washed over the unmade bed, the cedar dresser, the open closet door. The room appeared empty. The frost-caked window rattled violently against the wind, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Just pull the cord and climb, Arthur told himself, his internal voice practically screaming. Pull it, climb, and pull the stairs up behind you. He took one more step, positioning himself directly beneath the attic panel. He reached his left hand up, his gloved fingers grazing the fraying nylon cord. As he gripped it, a sound emerged from the darkness of the master bedroom. It wasn't a scratch. It wasn't a thump. It was a voice. Ah. The pronunciation was wet, guttural, and horribly distorted, like vocal cords that had forgotten how to form human words. It mimicked the cadence of his own voice, completely devoid of emotion. Arthur's blood turned to ice. He jerked the nylon cord downward. The wooden panel swung open, and the heavy folding stairs crashed down onto the hallway floor with a thunderous bang. From the shadows of the master bedroom ceiling, directly above the closet door, a pale, elongated figure dropped to the floor with a sickening, meaty thud. It uncoiled its impossible limbs, its hollow black eyes locking onto Arthur. Whispers of the White Divide, Chapter 8, The Last Shell. Arthur. The sound of his own name twisted through a throat that sounded like tearing wet canvas, shattered the last of Arthur's paralysis. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct took over. The pale creature didn't run, it launched itself. Its impossibly long, multi-jointed legs coiled and sprang, sending its skeletal frame hurtling through the air, across the master bedroom, directly toward the hallway where Arthur stood. Its jaw unhinged, revealing rows of needle-like, translucent teeth. Arthur didn't even have time to bring the stock of the shotgun to his shoulder. Firing from the hip, he aimed the heavy barrel squarely at the center of the doorway and squeezed the trigger. Boom! The deafening roar of the 12 gauge in the narrow hallway was absolute thunder. The muzzle flash strobed brilliant orange, illuminating the creature mid-air for a frozen, terrifying microsecond. The buckshot caught the thing in its left shoulder and chest. The sheer kinetic force of the heavy lead knocked it backward, spinning it out of the air. It crashed hard against the cedar dresser inside the bedroom with a sickening crack of splintering wood and a high-pitched vibrating shriek that made Arthur's ears bleed. He didn't wait to see if it was dead. He knew it wasn't. He dropped the empty shotgun, a useless piece of heavy iron now, and threw himself at the base of the folding attic stairs. He scrambled up the narrow wooden steps on his hands and knees, his heavy boots slipping on the slick rungs. He slammed his shin hard against the wood, tearing the fabric of his trousers, but the surge of adrenaline masked the pain completely. And then his flashlight beam caught it, sitting on top of a battered wooden steamer trunk. In the far corner, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a rectangular metal box with an array of dials, a coiled black wire, and a heavy microphone. The CB radio. Arthur scrambled toward it, ignoring the frantic, rhythmic scratching echoing from the hatch behind him. He fell to his knees in front of the trunk and wiped the dust from the face of the radio. It was a vintage Cobra model. He traced the thick black power cord with his flashlight. It ran from the back of the unit, trailing across the floorboards, and disappeared into a heavy marine battery sitting on the floor. "Please," Arthur whispered, his breath pluming in the icy air. "Please, have a charge." He reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the heavy silver toggle switch on the front panel. To on. Nothing happened. No lights. No static. The radio was dead. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 9. The Dead Air. Thwack. Thwack. Crack. The sound of the creature throwing its weight against the attic hatch was deafening. The heavy iron latch Arthur had thrown was holding, but the old pine boards of the door itself were beginning to bow upward. A jagged 6-inch splinter ripped free from the center of the wood, exposing a sliver of the dark hallway below. Arthur scrambled backward, his breath pluming in thick white clouds in the sub-zero air of the attic. He swung his flashlight back to the Cobra CB radio sitting on the steamer trunk. The heavy marine battery was a lost cause. The terminals were caked in a thick, powdery layer of blue-green corrosion. It had been dead for a decade. He couldn't use it. And if he wired the 12-volt direct current radio straight into the 120-volt alternating current wiring of the house, he would fry the radio's motherboard instantly. He knew just enough about electronics to know he was screwed. Crack! Another piece of the hatch splintered. A long gray finger hooked through the gap, blindly probing the freezing air of the attic. It was covered in a thick, dark blood. Its own from the shotgun blast. The buckshot hadn't killed it. It had only made it desperate. Think, Arthur, think, he hissed to himself, slapping the side of his own freezing face to stay focused. He ripped open the brass latches of the steamer trunk. The hinges screamed in protest. He threw the heavy lid back, shining his flashlight inside. Moth-eaten wool blankets, a stack of vintage Field and Stream magazines, a rusty tackle box, and beneath a folded canvas tarp, a heavy vented metal box with a thick, three-pronged power cord. Arthur grabbed it. It was a vintage pyramid-regulated power supply. The property manager's grandfather hadn't always used the battery. He had used this to convert the cabin's wall power to run the 12-volt radio. Just the white noise of the storm, interfering with the radio waves. Please, God, Arthur begged, pressing the button again. Mayday, I am under attack. The roads are snowed in. I am at the Blackwood cabin. Does anyone copy? He let go of the button. Static. And then a voice cut through the hiss. It was faint, drowned out by the interference of the blizzard, but it was unmistakably human. A deep, gravelly voice with a thick Colorado drawl. Copy you, Blackwood cabin. This is Highway Patrol out of Silver Creek. Weather is 0 visibility. What is the nature of your emergency? Over. Arthur let out a sob of pure relief. I'm trapped, he yelled into the mic. There's something in the house. You have to send a snowcat, a helicopter, anything. It's breaking through the floor right now. Before the dispatcher could reply, the attic hatch completely gave way. With an explosive crunch, wood fragments rained down into the hallway. The creature pulled its horrifying skeletal body up through the jagged hole. In the dim ambient light bleeding up from the hallway, Arthur could see the gaping, ragged hole in its chest where the buckshot had hit it. It wasn't bleeding normal blood. It was a thick, black, viscous fluid that smelled of rust and decay. The creature's hollow black eyes locked onto Arthur. It unhinged its jaw and let out a deafening, vibrating shriek that made the amber lights on the radio flicker. Arthur dropped the microphone. It clattered against the floorboards, the dispatcher's voice still calling his name through the static. He was out of shells. He had no weapons. And the creature was finally in the room with him. Whispers of the White Divide, Chapter 10. The Conductor. The creature didn't walk. It flowed. Its multi-jointed limbs propelled its skeletal body across the dusty attic floorboards with the horrifying disjointed speed of a dying insect. Arthur scrambled backward, his boots kicking up clouds of decades-old dust. He collided hard with the central wooden pillar supporting the roof. His breath knocked out of his lungs in a sharp white cloud. He was completely out of room. Through the hissing static of the CB radio behind him, the dispatcher's voice was a tinny, desperate ghost. Arthur? Arthur? Do you copy? What is your situation? We are trying to mobilize a plow, but the pass is completely a guttural, vibrating hiss drowned out the radio. The creature lunged. Arthur threw his right arm up instinctively. The creature's elongated pale hands closed around his forearm. The grip was like freezing iron. Razor-sharp nails tore effortlessly through the thick wool of his coat, sinking deep into the flesh beneath. Arthur screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore his throat as hot blood instantly soaked his sleeve. The thing dragged him forward, its unhinged jaw snapping inches from his face. The stench of it was paralyzing, a suffocating wave of rotten earth and the coppery tang of the thick, black fluid oozing from the buckshot wound in its chest. Its hollow black eyes held no malice, only a cold, ravenous emptiness. Arthur's left hand scrambled blindly across the floorboards. He needed a weapon. Anything. His fingers brushed against empty cardboard, then a stack of slick magazines, and finally, the heavy, knurled metal grip of the flashlight he had dropped. He gripped it like a club and swung with every ounce of terrifying adrenaline pumping through his heart. The heavy iron cylinder connected solidly with the side of the creature's skull with a wet, heavy crack. The monster shrieked, a sound so high-pitched it felt like a needle driving into Arthur's eardrums. Its grip on his arm loosened for a fraction of a second. Arthur kicked out violently, his heavy winter boot planting squarely into the gaping black wound on the creature's chest. It flew backward, its spindly limbs thrashing, and slammed into the rusted frame of the old bicycle. But it didn't stay down. It immediately began to right itself, its head twitching at a sickening, broken angle. Arthur knew he couldn't beat it to death with a flashlight. It was too fast, too unnaturally resilient. He glanced frantically around the cramped space, the steamer trunk, the radio, the power supply humming on the floor. The power supply. It was wired directly into the cabin's 120-volt wall outlet. Arthur looked at the creature, then at the thick, black puddle of its own viscous blood dripping onto the floorboards from its chest wound. Water conducts electricity. Whatever that black sludge is, it has to be conductive. The creature coiled its legs beneath it, readying for another leap. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy pyramid power supply box with both hands. He didn't unplug it from the wall. Instead, he gripped the two bare spliced wires, the red and the black, that he had clamped onto the back of the box to power the radio. He ripped them free from the terminals. Live, unregulated electrical current sparked dangerously in his hands. He could feel the aggressive hum of the electricity vibrating right through the thick rubber insulation of the wires. The creature launched itself through the air, its jaw snapping wide, aiming straight for Arthur's throat. Arthur dropped to his knees, sliding under the creature's arc, As its pale, skeletal chest passed directly over him, Arthur thrust both of his hands upward, plunging the live, sparking wires directly into the wet, black wound on the monster's torso. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. 120 bolts of alternating current surged directly into the creature's conductive bloodstream. The monster didn't just scream. It seized violently in midair. Its limbs snapped completely rigid, locking at impossible, grotesque angles. The black fluid boiling out of its chest began to literally smoke, filling the freezing attic with the atrocious smell of burning ozone and scorched rot. The sheer force of the muscle spasms threw the creature backward. It crashed onto the floorboards, its body convulsing so violently that the entire attic shook. The fluorescent lights downstairs surged and flickered wildly as the electrical grid strained against the massive short circuit. Arthur scrambled away, his chest heaving, clutching his bleeding arm. The creature thrashed its way toward the open hatch, unable to control its own electrocuted nervous system. With one final violent spasm, its long, spindly legs kicked out, pushing its smoking body over the edge of the jagged hole. It plummeted through the floorboards. Arthur heard a heavy, wet thud as it hit the second-floor hallway below, followed by the sound of agonizing, dragging movements retreating toward the stairs. Arthur didn't wait to see if it would recover. He pushed himself up, grabbed the heavy, iron-bound steamer trunk, and dragged it with a roar of exertion directly over the splintered hole in the floor. He collapsed against the trunk, gasping for air, clutching his torn, bleeding forearm against his chest. The smell of ozone and burnt meat was suffocating. Whispers of the White Divide, Chapter 11. The Witching Hour. The immediate threat was gone, but the silence that replaced it was almost worse. The acrid stench of scorched ozone and burnt rot hung thick in the freezing air of the attic. Arthur sat slumped against the heavy steamer trunk he had dragged over the splintered hole in the floorboards. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps as the pure, blinding adrenaline began to ebb from his bloodstream. The pain rushed in to take its place. His left forearm was on fire. The creature's razor-sharp nails had sliced through his thick wool coat, his flannel shirt, and deep into the muscle. The warm, sticky flow of blood was already beginning to freeze against his skin in the sub-zero temperature of the attic. "Okay," Arthur muttered, his teeth chattering violently. "Okay. Stop the bleeding. Just stop the bleeding." He forced himself to move. Using his right hand and his teeth, he managed to unbutton and peel off his ruined wool coat. But cold hit him instantly, a physical blow that seized his lungs. He unbuttoned his flannel shirt, wincing as the fabric peeled away from the jagged claw marks. He ripped the bottom hem of the shirt, tearing off a long strip of cotton. He wrapped the makeshift bandage tightly around his forearm, tying it off with a brutal knot that made him cry out into the dark. It wasn't pretty, and it probably wasn't sanitary, but it would buy him time. He crawled over to the open steamer trunk. His flashlight beam swept over the contents until he found a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket. He pulled it out, shaking off decades of dust, and wrapped it tightly around his shivering shoulders. It smelled like mildew and old cedar, but it was the only thing standing between him and hypothermia. Arthur dragged himself back toward the Cobra CB radio. The amber dial glowed warmly, casting long, wavering shadows against the skeletal rafters. The power supply box he had used as a weapon was still sitting on the floor, its wires scorched and melted at the tips, but miraculously, it was still feeding power to the radio. He picked up the heavy black microphone with his good hand. He pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Pendleton. I copy." His voice was weak, trembling from the cold and the shock. The static hissed for a long moment before the gravelly voice of the Colorado State Trooper cut through. "Pendleton. Thank God. We lost you there. What is your status?" "Over." "I'm in the attic," Arthur said, pulling the wool blanket tighter. I heard it. Electrocuted it. It fell back down to the second floor. But I'm bleeding, and it's freezing up here. Listen to me, Arthur. You are doing exactly what you need to do. You stay put. You keep pressure on that wound. We have a DOT snowplow and 2 cruisers pushing up the mountain road right now. The blizzard is dumping 2 inches an hour, so it's slow going, but we are coming. You just have to hold on. What time do you have?" "Over." Arthur glanced at the glowing hands of his wristwatch. 3:15. Sunrise is at 7:10. The dispatcher said, "You just have to make it a few more hours. Talk to me, Arthur. Where are you from? What do you do? Keep your brain engaged." "I'm a writer," Arthur whispered, leaning his head back against the central wooden pillar. "From Chicago. Came up here to finish a book." "Stupid. So stupid." "Not stupid, just bad timing." The dispatcher replied steadily. "What kind of book?" For the next hour, he talked. He talked about his manuscript, about the noise of the city, about his empty apartment. He talked simply to keep the dark at bay, his voice a frail lifeline tethering him to humanity. Whispers of the White Divide. Chapter 12. The deep freeze, the silence that followed the death of the generator, was absolute, heavy, and crushing. It was as if a vacuum had been unsealed, sucking every trace of warmth and life out of the cabin. Without the low mechanical rumble vibrating through the floorboards, the true power of the blizzard outside became terrifyingly clear. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, battering the steep A-frame roof just inches above Arthur's head with the force of a freight train. Arthur sat frozen in the pitch black. The amber glow of the CB radio, his only tether to the outside world, was dead. He pressed the button on the microphone one last time. "Dispatch, dispatch, are you there?" Not even the hiss of static. The power supply box was just a useless brick of metal now. He dropped the microphone. His left arm throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm, but the sharp pain of the claw marks was already beginning to fade. That terrified him more than the pain itself. The numbness was setting in. The blood soaking the makeshift cotton bandage had begun to stiffen and freeze in the sub-zero air. The temperature inside the uninsulated attic was plummeting by the minute. Without the furnace pushing heat up from below, the cabin was rapidly surrendering to the storm. Arthur clicked on the heavy iron flashlight. The beam was noticeably weaker, the battery draining from the extreme cold. He had to conserve it. He swept the fading yellow light over the attic space one more time, his teeth chattering so violently he thought they might crack. I need more layers. I need insulation. He dragged himself back to the steamer trunk, keeping his weight carefully distributed to avoid making the floorboards creak. He plunged his good hand past the moth-eaten wool blankets and the vintage magazines, digging blindly into the very bottom of the trunk. His numb fingers brushed against something slick and synthetic. He gripped it and pulled. It was an old, heavy-duty sleeping bag, the kind meant for alpine camping, thick with goose down, though it smelled strongly of dust and age. It was a godsend. Arthur killed the flashlight, plunging himself back into the terrifying dark. Working entirely by touch, he managed to worm his way inside the sleeping bag, pulling it up over the wool blanket, already wrapped around his shoulders. He zipped it up as high as it would go, burying his face in the thick collar. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait. Time distorted in the dark, without the radio to distract him. Every minute stretched into an agonizing eternity. He curled into a tight ball, his knees pressed against his chest, trying to trap whatever body heat he had left. By 5:30 a.m., the cabin began to die. It started with a sharp, echoing crack from the kitchen below, loud enough to make Arthur jump inside his sleeping bag. The silence had allowed the deep freeze to penetrate the walls. The water pipes, sitting stagnant without the pump or the boiler, were bursting. Crack, groan. The timber framing of the house contracted violently against the freezing temperatures, sounding like bones snapping in the dark. Arthur kept his eyes squeezed shut. The hypothermia was playing tricks on his mind. He felt a heavy, lethargic warmth spreading through his chest, a dangerous, deceptive comfort urging him to just go to sleep. Just close your eyes, Arthur. It doesn't hurt anymore. He bit down hard on his lower lip, using the sharp sting of pain to anchor himself to reality. He tasted copper. Wake up, he slurred to himself. Stay awake. They're coming. At 6:15 a.m., a new sound cut through the groaning of the freezing cabin. It was soft at first, a wet, labored wheeze. Arthur's eyes snapped open in the pitch black. The lethargy vanished, replaced by a fresh, icy spike of adrenaline. Wheeze? Click, click. It wasn't downstairs anymore. The sound was coming from directly beneath him. Right below the heavy steamer trunk, he had pushed over the hole in the floorboards. The creature hadn't left. It hadn't died from the electricity. It had dragged its scorched, broken body back up the stairs, and it was waiting. It didn't attack the wood. It didn't scream. It simply pressed its face against the underside of the floorboards, breathing. The clicking sound was its translucent teeth gnashing together in a slow, rhythmic cadence. It was psychological warfare. The predator knew its prey was trapped, freezing, and bleeding out. It was perfectly content to let the mountain do the killing for it, waiting to claim whatever was left. Arthur clamped both hands over his ears, trembling uncontrollably inside the sleeping bag. He stared up into the impenetrable darkness, praying for the sun. Whispers of the White Divide, Chapter 13. First Light. Finale. The numbness had finally won. Arthur couldn't feel his legs, his fingers, or the throbbing wound on his arm. The agonizing cold had been replaced by a heavy, terrifying warmth. He knew what it meant. His core temperature was dropping to critical levels. The hypothermia was singing him to sleep in the pitch black of the attic. Beneath the floorboards, the creature's wet breathing and the rhythmic click, click, click of its teeth had become a hypnotic lullaby. It was just waiting for his heart to stop. Just close your eyes, the dark seemed to whisper. Arthur let his eyelids flutter shut. His chin rested against the frozen fabric of the sleeping bag. Then the clicking stopped. The creature let out a low, vibrating hiss. It wasn't directed at Arthur. It was directed outside. Arthur's eyes forced themselves open. Through the heavy, frost-caked slats of the attic's gable vent, a light pierced the darkness. It wasn't the pale, ghostly light of the moon. It was a rhythmic, sweeping flash of brilliant red and blue. A moment later, a sound overpowered the screaming wind. It was the deep, guttural roar of a massive diesel engine, accompanied by the violent scraping of heavy steel against ice. A Department of Transportation snowplow was tearing through the driveway. Pendleton? The voice didn't come from the radio. It came from a megaphone outside, booming through the blizzard. Beneath Arthur, the creature shrieked, a sound of pure chaotic rage and sudden vulnerability. The floorboards violently shook as it scrambled away from the hatch, its heavy claws tearing down the hallway and thundering down the wooden stairs to the ground floor. Arthur tried to shout, but his frozen throat only produced a dry, ragged croak. Downstairs, the heavy oak front door was hit with a force that shook the entire cabin frame. Crash! The wood splintered. State police! Clear the entryway! Move, move, move! Heavy tactical boots pounded against the pine floorboards. Beams of blinding white tactical flashlights cut through the dark of the living room. Suddenly, the creature unleashed a deafening, metallic scream from the kitchen. It was followed instantly by chaos, men shouting in sheer terror. The heavy, deafening bang, bang, bang of high-caliber service rifles discharging inside the confined space of the cabin. Glass shattering, furniture crashing to the floor. Arthur buried his face in the sleeping bag, covering his ears as the gunfire roared. Then, abruptly, there was silence. Only the steady rumble of the snowplow outside and the wind howling through the shattered windows. Jesus Christ! A voice echoed from downstairs, trembling with shock. What the hell was that? Did you hit it? It went through the back window. It's in the trees. Watch the tree line. Pendleton! Arthur Pendleton! Arthur weakly pushed his right hand against the steamer trunk. It barely moved an inch, but the scrape of wood on wood was enough. Up here, in the attic, a trooper yelled. Hands grabbed the splintered edges of the hatch, tearing the broken wood away completely. Two beams of light flooded the attic. A state trooper, his face pale and his breath pluming in the freezing air, pulled himself up. He saw Arthur curled in the sleeping bag. I got him. Paramedics, bring the bag up. We got him. They pulled Arthur from the sleeping bag. His body felt like dead weight, stiff and unresponsive. As they carried him down through the narrow hatch, the light from their flashlights illuminated the cabin. It was a war zone. The heavy oak table was flipped. The walls were riddled with bullet holes, and the massive bay window in the living room was completely shattered, exposing the interior to the raging blizzard. Of the creature, there was no sign, only a thick trail of black, viscous fluid leading out into the pristine, swirling snow. They rushed Arthur out the front door and into the blinding lights of the rescue convoy. The blast of heat from the ambulance was like walking into an oven. As the EMTs swarmed him, cutting away his bloody clothes and wrapping him in thermal foil, Arthur turned his head to look back at the Blackwood cabin one last time. The dark timber frame stood defiant against the whiteout, a silent monument to the nightmare he had survived. The troopers were setting up a perimeter, their rifles raised toward the dark, impenetrable tree line of the Colorado Rockies. Arthur closed his eyes as the ambulance door slammed shut, shutting out the howling wind. He was alive. But as the vehicle began its slow descent down the mountain, he knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The storm would eventually pass, but whatever was living in the White Divide was still out there.